Welcome everyone to the Canadian Diabetes Association's 2016 webinar series. My name is Farah Ismail and I will be your host for today. We are delighted that you're able to join us today for the webinar to learn about what is the glycemic index. Now to start off, I'd like to draw your attention to the survey. It's located at the top right-hand section of your screen. In order to better serve your needs, we kindly ask you provide us with your input by completing the short survey towards the end of our presentation. And we thank you in advance for your input. Throughout the presentation, you will have the opportunity to type in a question and answer box that's located at the bottom right-hand section of your screen. And we ask that you use this for any questions you have along the way, and our presenter will be happy to respond to them at the end of our presentation. As well, we will be displaying a few polling questions throughout the presentation and would love for your participation. It is important to note that our polling questions do remain completely anonymous. Also note that you're able to customize your screens. You can expand or collapse them as you see fit, so feel free to do so by dragging down the bottom right-hand corner of each of the webinar pods. Our presentation today will last about 35 to 40 minutes in length, and we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. It is important to note that we are recording today's presentation, and it will be made available on our CDA website as well as our CDA YouTube channel at a later date. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to thank our supporter, Canola Eat Well, for being part of our webinar program. And now I'd like to welcome our speaker, Kathryn Arcudi, and thank her for joining us today. But before turning it over to Kathryn, I'd like to give you a brief introduction. Kathryn graduated with a bachelor's degree in nutritional sciences from McGill University in 1988 and started specializing in diabetes. In 2000, Kathryn became a certified diabetes educator. She has been an active volunteer with the CDA in the areas of professional program planning and volunteer coordination for the professional conferences. This year, Kathryn received the Volunteer of the Year Award on behalf of the Canadian Diabetes Association. For more information on Kathryn, please read the speaker bio section, which is located to the left of your screen. So without further ado, I present to you Kathryn Arcudi.
Thank you, Farah, for that nice introduction. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today to speak to you about the glycemic index and the glycemic load. And I've entitled my talk, A Tale of Two Theories, because that's exactly what glycemic index and glycemic load are. And there is a lot of controversy sometimes about whether they should be included as part of healthy meal planning. Before we start our talk, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. How are you affected by diabetes? So if you could please choose an answer and click the Submit button. Great. Thanks for answering that question. It looks like we have a variety of people on the line. Now I'd just like to get an idea of how you are participating today. Are you participating as an individual, in a group of 2 to 5, or in a group of 6 or more? So it looks that most of you are participating as an individual. So throughout the talk, I'm hoping that you'll become familiar with the concept of glycemic index, learn how to make some lower glycemic index food choices, have a better understanding of the impact that the quantity of food, which we refer to as the glycemic load, can have on after-meal blood glucose levels, and also be aware of some practical tips that can help improve the quality and the quantity of the foods that you consume. A great way to start is for us to actually define what the glycemic index is. So the glycemic index is actually a number. It's a relative ranking from 0 to 100 of the rate to which and extent to which that the available carbohydrate in food is digested and absorbed as compared to glucose. And we use glucose as a standard in general. So really it's like a representative of the quality of the carbohydrate that you're eating. So if you look at the graph on the side, what you're going to see is that there's a big red line that kind of goes up very quickly and then comes down much more quickly. And that's basically how your body would respond if it ate a high glycemic index food, as opposed to that nice little rolling hill of a green line, which is much closer to how a food would respond if it had a lower glycemic index. So let's talk about those glycemic index values and what they mean. So you might notice that there's a little color scheme going on here, and it kind of looks like the traffic lights, and there's a reason for that. I kind of like using that analogy, and I know that there are diet books out there. Dr. Rick Gallup has written some books called The GI Diet, and where he uses the symbolism of the traffic light, and I think it's easy because green means go, right? Eat more of. It's a healthier choice. Yellow tells us to be a bit more cautious. And of course, I don't like the red being stop because I really don't believe that people should not eat foods that are higher in GI, but I think it just means let's be extra cautious. Think of a red hot potato. You wouldn't want to keep it very long in your hands. It doesn't mean that you might not want to try it, but you wouldn't want to have it on a regular basis. So let's look at what some of those numbers actually mean. So a low glycemic index food is a glycemic index food that has less than 55 as a number. So what that means is, like I showed in the graph earlier on in the presentation, that it leads to a slower rise in blood glucose level after you eat it. So it provides a more sustained source of energy to the body. Whereas a high glycemic index food, which is a glycemic index food that has a number of 70 or more, would provide a more rapid rise in blood glucose levels. So you saw that larger spike of blood glucose after eating that food, and it would supply a more quick energy for a shorter period of time, and that's why these types of food tend to cause your blood glucose level to go lower more quickly, but there's a big spike prior to that, and we want to try and avoid that as much as possible. I spoke about the controversy a little earlier on about the glycemic index, and part of it is because it really isn't a concept or a theory that we can use in isolation. Because yes, it refers to the quality of a food, but there are other factors that can affect the glycemic index. And obviously we don't eat these foods generally in isolation. And so the fat content and the protein content of foods can also impact their glycemic index. And the major reason for this is because fat and protein do take longer to digest in the body, so they will alter that curve of how high and how quick the blood glucose level will rise after eating the food. Time for a quick question. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of glycemic index and which foods are low glycemic index and that, I'd just like to get an idea from you what you think the glycemic index is measuring. Is it measuring blood fats? Is it measuring blood glucose, cholesterol, or water? Great. The correct response is blood glucose. So kudos to those who got it correct. So now let's take a look at what some low GI food choices would be. So barley, bran buds, lentils, these are all great choices to make. Now you'll notice that right now there's only one cereal on this list, and that's because many cereals tend to be much higher in glycemic index. And that's why processed foods and cereals being processed generally will have a higher glycemic index. The breads are not all created equal, and that's why here we have 100% stone ground whole wheat bread as being a low GI food choice. However, you'll see later on that white bread would be considered high GI. In general, most fruits are considered low GI food choices, as well as most milk and dairy products. So there's some interesting things to note here in the medium GI food choices. So we have oatmeal here as a medium GI food choice. However, the processing of the oatmeal can greatly impact its glycemic index. So oatmeal that is steel cut could actually have a low glycemic index. Large flake oatmeal is a medium GI food, and those instant pouches, because they're much more highly processed, tend to be on the end of medium going into the high glycemic index range. Potatoes are another one that can vary very much depending on the type of potato and how it's cooked, because essentially a sweet potato or a yam is actually considered a low glycemic index food, whereas a baked russet potato has a higher glycemic index. So if you have a new potato, those little baby potatoes, we tend to eat the skin with them, and so these would be considered medium GI choices. And then pita bread as well is a medium GI choice. Some people might be really shocked to see that bran flakes and Cheerios are considered high GI choices because a lot of the marketing around these is that they're very healthy for you. And yes, bran flakes does have fiber, and Cheerios has wonderful soluble fiber, which is supposed to be good for heart disease. However, because they are processed cereals, they are actually digested much more quickly by the body. Rice is another interesting one because short, sticky rice has a high glycemic index. Basmati rice actually is a medium glycemic index rice, and the brown rice or the Uncle Ben's converted rice happens to have a low glycemic index. So again, changing the type of rice or grain that you eat sometimes can highly impact the amount of glycemic index that we're looking into. And of course, white bread is refined white flour, so it also has a high glycemic index. And most crackers, unfortunately, because again, they're processed foods, right? Crackers in general are processed foods. They are actually high GI choices. It's time for another polling question. Which of the following statements below is correct? I should only choose foods which have a low glycemic index. I am better off eating a chocolate bar than watermelon as it has a lower glycemic index. Glycemic index should be the only thing I look at to make my food choices. All foods can fit. Taking a low glycemic index food at a meal with a higher glycemic index food at the same meal can help to moderate the blood glucose rise. This one was a little tougher, wasn't it? The message I'm trying to get across is really that all foods can fit, because it really is true that if you take some low glycemic index food at a meal where there are some high glycemic index food, then you're going to get closer to a medium glycemic index for that meal. And so there is no reason that you need to completely avoid foods that are high in glycemic index. You just need to try and pair them with some lower glycemic index foods, and then your body won't react the same way as if it was eating that high glycemic index food alone in isolation. So now that we've talked a little bit about what the glycemic index is and what numbers, what we're looking for in terms of low glycemic index foods, I think it's important that we look at what are some of the factors that can also influence the glycemic index of a food. So the first one is food processing, and I think I've mentioned that one already a couple of times. But essentially, the more processed a food is, the higher its glycemic index, and the more quickly it will be digested, because if it's more processed, your body has less work to do, and it doesn't have to work as hard to digest that food. Some people perhaps don't realize that cooking foods can actually increase the glycemic index of that food. Why? Because when you cook the food, it swells the starch molecules that are in that food, making them easier to digest. Another interesting note, and newer research has just shown, that actually cooling foods can also have an impact on its glycemic index. So if you take either rice or actually potatoes and you cook them, now some rice and some potatoes have a higher glycemic index, but if you cool that rice or those potatoes, and then you use them in a rice salad or a potato salad, you'll actually help to lower the glycemic index of that food. So I know I'm really harping on the processed stuff, but it really is important to try and choose some minimally processed foods and grains. So examples of these minimally processed foods are the steel-cut oats, quinoa, which is also high in protein, pearl barley, pumpernickel bread, al dente pasta, buckwheat, and pearl couscous. Here are some other factors that can influence the glycemic index of your food. So the fat content of the food can have an impact on glycemic index. One of the reasons is that the fat content in the food actually helps to slow down the absorption and digestion of these foods. Now, initially, you'd think that's a great thing. Unfortunately, sometimes that blood glucose level goes up a lot later on in the continuum of things. And so we need to be careful with that, because if you were to look at glycemic index in isolation and only look at the actual number, a Mars bar actually has a lower glycemic index than carrots, but I would never tell someone that they should eat a Mars bar instead of carrots. If we look at the acid content of foods, this is something that can be quite interesting to help us lower the glycemic index of our meals, because the acid present in a food has also been shown to slow down the digestion of foods that are consumed at the same meal. So how easy is it to add lemon juice or vinegar into a salad dressing? And if you make your salad dressing at home, there's a lot less sodium in it as well. And for those of you who just can't tolerate whole grain bread, obviously white bread is highly refined and it has a high glycemic index. However, studies have shown that if you use sourdough bread, so the true sourdough bread, which was made from an acid bread, the acidity of that bread does not lend one to have a high rise of blood glucose after its consumption, so it has a lower glycemic index than the average white bread. So now that we've talked about what factors can influence glycemic index, what glycemic index is, which foods should I perhaps be trying to choose more often, I guess we should ask ourselves, well, why should I be doing this, right? What impact can choosing lower GI foods more often actually have on your health? So if we take a look at the research that's been done, a lot of research has talked about that it can help to reduce the hunger feelings that you have between meals because it helps to increase your feeling of fullness. It can also help to increase your rate of weight loss as compared to conventional diets, and especially the actual fat mass loss as opposed to lean body mass loss, which can also happen in conventional diets. It can help prevent weight regain, so you don't regain the weight as quickly as in a conventional diet. It definitely can help to decrease those blood glucose spikes after meals, because when you eat lower glycemic index foods, it will affect how high the blood glucose rises after the meal. It can also lower your risk of getting heart disease, especially because heart disease is often related to that after-meal blood glucose spike. And if you have prediabetes or if you don't have diabetes, there are studies that have also shown that it can help lower your risk of getting type 2 diabetes. So there's a lot of great reasons why perhaps we should be looking at trying to opt for more lower GI choices in our foods. So let's move on to talking about glycemic load now. So we talked a lot about glycemic index, which, remember, the word that comes to mind when we're talking about glycemic index is the quality of the food. And the word that should come to mind when we talk about the glycemic load is the quantity of the food, the how much. And so essentially that term, glycemic load, is really looking into both the quality and the quantity, but there's a huge emphasis on the quantity and the amount of the carbohydrate that's eaten. And that's why some people feel that it better reflects how our food choices that we make at the meal, especially with relation to portion size, will have an influence on our post-meal blood glucose levels. Now, I promise I'm not going to get into very calculated mathematics, and I am not going to be expecting you guys to actually calculate the glycemic load of the meal. I just figure it's important for you to understand where this number comes from. So the glycemic load is an equation. It's simply an equation of the number of grams of available carbohydrate from the food that you're eating, which is the how much, multiplied by the glycemic index of that carbohydrate, which is kind of like how fast is it going to raise that blood glucose, divided by 100. So when we look at glycemic load values, again, we get into that green, yellow, and red range. And so essentially, a low glycemic load is if it would have a number of 10 or less. A medium glycemic load is if it would have a number between 11 and 19. A high glycemic load is if it would have a number 20 or higher. So not that I want to focus too much on numbers, but I think it's important for us to take a look at different foods and see what their glycemic load would be. So an apple a day keeps the doctor away, right? And that's what we always say. We have that little adage. And essentially, one apple is a low glycemic load. Oh, sorry about that. I just noticed that the number doesn't appear in that green box. And the reason it's green is because it's low low GL, which would be 5.6. However, can you imagine, because you thought that an apple was healthy and you decided to eat 10 in a row, besides getting a tummy ache from having 10 in a row, you would actually have a very high glycemic load meal or snack, whatever you would want to call that. So portion size is truly key here. And I just had to talk about carrots because I'm sure that many of you have been told or have read something in the past that says that you should stay away from carrots because they're just way too sweet. Well, lo and behold, half a cup of carrots actually has a low glycemic load. It only has a glycemic load of 4.1. So you'd have to eat more than a cup and a half of carrots before reaching a higher glycemic load. So again, portion size is key. And I would never tell people that they have to stay away from carrots. Obviously, I wouldn't want them to eat a 5-pound bag, but then again, we're getting back to that tummy ache. If you're going to eat 5 pounds, that's a lot of carrots. Here's another great one, watermelon. Again, I have lots of clients coming to me and they've been told by someone or another not to have any watermelon. But again, it's all about portion. A cup of watermelon is in the green. It is low glycemic load. So you'd have to eat more than 3 cups of watermelon before it reaches a high glycemic load. So I'm not encouraging you to eat 3 cups of watermelon because your blood glucose level might just jump quite high after that. But certainly 1 cup of watermelon as part of a balanced meal, there should be no problem with you being able to handle that. Pasta is one of those interesting ones because in essence, pasta actually has a low glycemic index. The problem with pasta, again, is that portion size and how many people can stop themselves and eat only 1 cup of pasta. Because if you only had a half a cup of pasta, it would be considered a low glycemic load food. But you see, that would be trying to treat pasta like a side dish. And that's not what we do here, is it? What we tend to do is pasta as the main dish, and we end up having like 2 or 3 cups of pasta, some people maybe even 4 cups of pasta at the time, and that's why it raises blood glucose levels. So it's not the fact that it's pasta, it's the fact that we tend to eat way too much of it. All right, so we've talked a lot about individual foods, but now let's change that focus to more of meals. And so in essence, in glycemic load, for a 2,000 calorie diet, which is really probably a diet that's closer to those of an average male that doesn't really need to lose weight if they're on the 60 to 75 age side, and perhaps for a younger person, someone who might want to lose a little bit of weight. The daily glycemic load should not exceed 100. That's what the research said. So if we break that down into 3 balanced meals, we're talking about each meal being around 33 in terms of a glycemic load. Again, I'm not expecting you to calculate it, but what I want to do is just to make you aware of the volume of food that this would result in. So in order to make sense of this, I figured the best way is let's choose a meal. Let's calculate the glycemic load of a meal so that we can get a sense of could we actually find a meal that would have that glycemic load of 33 or less. So I decided to take a breakfast meal. And when you're calculating the glycemic load of a meal, you actually just need to calculate the glycemic load of each individual item and then add them all up together. So 2 whole wheat toast, 1 to 2 eggs, a medium orange, and a cup of milk actually totals up to a glycemic load of 31. You'll notice that the eggs have 0 in glycemic load, and that's because a food that does not contain carbohydrate will not have a glycemic index or a glycemic load because the glycemic index and load are reflective of the amount of carbohydrate that is in the food. So this is quite a big breakfast, isn't it? And this would probably satisfy most people and might even be too big for some other people. And so it's still within a healthy meal plan. I wanted to compare it to choosing a smoothie as a breakfast as opposed to choosing a solid breakfast. And that's because I get a lot of clients who ask me about smoothies because there's a lot ado about smoothies these days, and research actually suggests that drinking your calories is not such a good idea if you want to lose weight. Why? Because your body doesn't recognize those calories the same way, and unfortunately you tend to eat the same amount of solid food afterwards. So if we take a look at a smoothie, the other issue with a smoothie is that you can pack a lot of punch into that glass that you're going to drink. So I just went online, I Googled smoothie, and I chose one of the first smoothie recipes that I found in order to calculate the glycemic load of that smoothie. So in essence, the recipe for the smoothie is a medium banana, a cup of vanilla yogurt, 3/4 of a cup of blueberries, and a kiwi. Now that's a lot of food. But when you blenderize all that into a smoothie, people can more easily eat that food. But I've got lots of clients that if I were to ask them to eat this much for breakfast, if they were to eat the solid food, would not be able to. It would be super, they'd be full. They'd be so full because it's a lot of food. So unfortunately, when you blenderize all of that food, you're not actually getting a sense of how much you've consumed. And so that's why, in my opinion, smoothies for some people may not be the best choice to make. But again, the only way you're going to know is to test your blood glucose before and 2 hours after and see how your body reacts to whatever food that you've decided and chosen to eat. Time for another polling question. What can the glycemic load be an indication of? The quality of the carbohydrate eaten? The quantity of carbohydrate eaten? The rise in blood glucose? Or all of the above? Don't you just love those questions where every single one of them is right, but there's always one that's more right than the others? So of course the answer is all of the above. Here's another question. Which of the following foods should you avoid? Carrots, watermelon, apples, or none of the above? So kudos to those that chose none of the above, because that's the answer. I really hope that you get that message that all foods can fit pretty much, and it really is all about the quantity and how often that you're going to have those foods. And just because one food might have a higher glycemic index than another does not mean that it needs to be avoided. So let's look at some useful tips that could maybe help you to incorporate those concepts of glycemic index and glycemic load into your meal planning. So remember, you don't need to remember actual numbers. You don't need to do any math. Now, there are some lists that exist where you can go and search for those numbers if you're a numbers type of person, but honestly, you really don't need that. You can easily, there are resources available. The Canadian Diabetes Association has a wonderful tool called the Glycemic Index tool, which has a small list about low, medium, and high GI foods that can help you. I think the first thing to do is to focus on foods that will contribute the highest amount of glycemic load to your meal, and that will really depend on who you are and what your favorite foods are. So swap your current bread if it's a higher GI one for a lower GI one. The same thing with breakfast cereals. Again, if you're eating a lot of higher GI rice, perhaps trying to choose a lower GI rice might be helpful. Change the type of potato that you're having for a lower GI one as well, and that can help. So even if you can just substitute half of the carbohydrates at your meal with lower GI sources, that can really help to lower the glycemic index and load of the meal by a fair amount. And here are some more practical tips, and really this has everything to do with the glycemic index and nothing to do with glycemic index. In general, it's because these are healthy things to do. Eating a variety of fresh fruits and vegetables and low-fat milk products, because they do have a generally low glycemic index, but they also provide some wonderful nutrients that are essential to good health. Legumes are an awesome thing to try because of their low glycemic index. Trying to choose them on occasion as the protein source for your meal, they're low-fat, great source of protein, high in fiber, and have a low glycemic index. So we do encourage people to try meatless meals a little more often in their meal plan. Why don't you experiment with some barley or couscous or bulgur in recipes, because they tend to have a lower glycemic index than some of the higher glycemic index rices like the sticky rice. So if you try these different grains, and that will also help to lower the glycemic index and load of your meal. And how do you know if all of these things are working? By making some healthier low GI choices, how can you tell if it's improving your diabetes control? Well, testing your blood glucose. If you measure your blood glucose before and after the same meal, so 2 hours after, that will help you to determine how your food choices has affected that blood glucose level. So it can help you to make healthier choices. It can help you to realize whether you need to worry about changing the quality of the food or perhaps the quantity of the food. And this is very individual, and that's why it's difficult for us as healthcare professionals to actually tell you, oh, this is better for you and this isn't, because different bodies react differently. So you will need to test your blood glucose level and see how your body responds. And some people's bodies respond differently to various grains and various carbohydrate choices. So let's take an example of a breakfast. So 2 slices of toast, preferably whole grain, some peanut butter for your protein, an orange, and a cup of milk. So you tested your blood glucose level before that meal, and it was at 6.3. Great, in range, at target, really wonderful. You ate this meal, and then 2 hours later you tested your blood glucose again, and you were at 9.3. So that's actually within range for most people, the target being less than 10 after a meal, unless your doctor or healthcare professional is aiming for even tighter control and wants your blood glucose less than 8. But in general, going up 2 or 3 points after a meal is considered quite good control. So of course, everyone always wants to blame the food. Right? So if your blood glucose increases considerably after a meal, and that isn't a very big meal, right? A meal that's like 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrate, you've chosen a soup that has barley in it, you've eaten a sandwich that's made with pumpernickel bread, so you've made these great choices, and despite all of that, your blood glucose level goes up a lot higher than you would have anticipated. We often assume, oh, it has to be the food. It's because I made the wrong choices. But honestly, if you're eating the right amount of food for you, you cannot cheat that way and say, I'm going to cut back to half of that food just to make sure I get good blood glucose control. Because you're going to get other health problems if you don't eat an adequate amount of food. So if it's an adequate amount of food for you and the blood glucose level goes up higher than that, then it's time to talk to your doctor or to your other healthcare professionals in terms of deciding whether the treatment for your diabetes needs to be modified. So it really comes down to a healthy balance. I really do believe that all foods can fit. I also really believe that every little change that you can make in your lifestyle does count. Choosing lower glycemic index foods more often, meaning improving the quality of the foods chosen, is great. And of course, higher glycemic index food can definitely be part of a healthy meal plan. Just consider portion size and what other foods are present at the same meal. So I know that FAQs are usually considered frequently asked questions, but I just couldn't help it. For me, it really does all come down to the FAQs. And the F is for frequency. Right? All foods can fit, but healthy choices should be eaten more frequently than less healthy choices. It just makes sense. A is for amount. Portion size is key, whether it's a healthier food or a less healthy food, because even healthy foods eaten in large amounts will increase the glycemic load and can impact blood glucose control. And Q is for quality. Right? So choose the foods that are less processed, because by choosing foods that are less processed, your body will have a harder time digesting them, and in general, it will help to lower that spike of blood glucose level after the meal. And I just want to end on the note that it's really not about dieting, because healthy living is not a diet. What we're asking you to think about is to really try and make healthier choices more often. And by doing that, you're increasing the odds of leading a healthy lifestyle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathryn, for providing us with a great presentation today. You've really given us a sound understanding of the glycemic index and how to make lower glycemic index food choices based on all the information you provided today. So we do want to thank you for that. So now it is time for the question period. So for the questions that we do not get to, please email us at webinars@diabetes.ca, and we'll be sure to get back to you as soon as possible. So with that being said, Kathryn, I'll take our first question here. So one of the questions is corn a good option for consumption? How does it fare based on the glycemic index?
So that's a very good question, and it's not one that we generally find popping up when we're looking for glycemic index. And of course, one has to remember that corn is a starchy food, so it's a starchy vegetable. So of course, when we're looking at diabetes meal planning, we have to think of the carbohydrate that is contained in the corn. However, when you look at glycemic index lists, depending on the type of corn, so frozen corn actually has a low glycemic index. In a serving size of about a half a cup, it would not have a huge glycemic load, whereas kernel corn has a slightly higher glycemic index, but still within the medium range. So I certainly believe that corn can definitely have a place to fit, as long as, again, as part of your balanced meal, you're looking into what other foods are available and how much carbohydrate your plan allows you.
Great, thank you so much for that. So our next question here is, why do high fiber foods have generally a higher glycemic index?
So that's interesting because, in essence, a lot of people do believe that fiber and glycemic index go hand in hand, but that's not necessarily the case. So some high-fiber foods do happen to have a higher glycemic index. So as I mentioned in the presentation, with the bran flakes, although they're a higher fiber cereal, for some reason, they also happen to be in the high glycemic index range. And the reason for this is really that processing. And that's why we cannot only rely on the fiber content of food to determine whether it's a good choice for us, because breakfast cereals in general tend to be highly processed. And so even those that don't contain a lot of sugar, which we would think would be great healthy choices, tend to raise after-meal blood glucose levels very high. And that's why we cannot only rely on the fiber content of foods. On the other hand, lentils have a high amount of fiber and also are very low glycemic index, right? So that's why it's not the same for every single food. So it really is important, if we're looking at glycemic index as one of the strategies that we want to use in meal planning, that we opt for those choices that have a lower glycemic index.
Great. Thank you so much for that clarification, Kathryn. Our next question here is around energy bars. And the question is really, are they low, medium, or high glycemic index? And are there any energy bars that you may, like a brand, for example, that you may recommend?
So in terms of energy bars, I always ask my client what they're looking for in terms of what are they trying to replace. Because I truly believe that as much as possible, we should be going towards less processed foods. So as much as some people are like, oh, well, energy bars have all of these good nutrients, well, they might have what appears to be healthy nutrients in them, but they've been processed. So it makes more sense to actually eat those nutrients in their natural form, and then they're going to be providing your body with a much better balance of calories and energy than when you're trying to concentrate that into an energy bar. And if you're overweight or obese and you're trying to lose weight, and that's one of the strategies that you want to do, you have to be mindful that sometimes those energy bars may be what you think is a good snack, but they're packing a big punch of calories and fat in some of these bars, and that might not be the best strategy for helping you to lose weight. And so I actually don't have a preferred energy bar, because I don't tend to recommend to my clients to go towards those. I really encourage them to try and choose healthy snacks that they can have in their natural state, because that's much better for them.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Kathryn. Our next question here is there a difference in terms of GI between raw, brown, and white sugar?
So in terms of natural sweeteners like the raw, brown, and white sugar, a lot of people think that there is a difference. A lot of people think that a raw sugar or a brown sugar is healthier than the white refined sugar. Some people will talk about, oh, honey is more natural, maple syrup is more natural. And although the glycemic index might be slightly lower for honey, maple syrup, The sugars themselves pretty much have a very similar glycemic index and very similar responses in the amounts that we would consume them. So if we take a look at the amount of sugar that one should have, the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, initially had said that not more than 10% of our calories should come from sugar, and they've since said that if possible, we should even try and bring that down to 5%. So just to give you an idea of what that would be, for someone who's allowed to eat 60 grams of carbohydrate at a meal, or that's what they've decided is the amount of carb that's good for them, 10% of that is 6 grams, and a teaspoon of sugar is like 4 to 5 grams of carbohydrate. So you really would want to be mindful that that's not a heck of a lot of sugar to be having at that one meal. And so if you want to take sugar, it has to be in small amounts, and you always have to go back to, is my diabetes well controlled? If I'm managed and my diabetes values are pretty much within target, then it's not that 1 teaspoon of sugar that's going to make my diabetes out of control. If I've just been diagnosed with diabetes and I'm struggling to get under better control of my diabetes and the blood glucose levels are higher, then obviously sometimes it's important to be a little bit more mindful and to stay away from some of these sugars until a time when that blood glucose control has improved.
Great. Thank you so much for that response, Kathryn. Our next question here is, can I follow a low GI lifestyle while I'm pregnant?
Well, that's a great question. I actually work in a gestational diabetes clinic, and absolutely, the newer research is showing that glycemic index diets are the way to go, because when you have gestational diabetes, which is diabetes during pregnancy, unfortunately your body has a much harder time tolerating certain amounts of carbohydrate and certain types of carbohydrate, and that also varies greatly from person to person. So it definitely is an individual response, and we need to work with you on an individual basis to figure out which foods seem to work better for you. And of course, the blood glucose targets during pregnancy are so tight because we're trying to protect the unborn fetus, that it really is important to decrease the quantity of carbohydrate taken at one time, because the rise in blood glucose that we're expecting is much lower. And so sometimes it does mean changing the type of food, so especially for people who are used to having a lot of white sticky rice, because traditionally that's what you would consume at a meal. One, we can try cutting back on the portion to see if that would help to keep you within those targets that we're looking for during pregnancy. But oftentimes we actually have to recommend to switch from a white sticky rice to a brown rice and see whether that would help to keep the blood glucose levels within target. And so there's a lot of manipulation that we can do with the type and the amount of carbohydrate during pregnancy to help manage diabetes during pregnancy with gestational diabetes during pregnancy with diet.
Great. Thank you so much for that detailed response. Our next question here is, should I entirely avoid foods that are high GI?
Oh, I certainly hope not, because life would be boring otherwise. I really think it comes back to, again, that adage that all foods can fit. I do not believe that for the rest of your life you would need to avoid foods that are high glycemic index. I think what you might want to do, though, is don't have them in isolation. Right? So a lot of people tend to take high glycemic index foods as snacks on their own, standalone, in the middle of the day. We all know that when you eat, usually 2 hours after you eat is when your blood glucose level tends to be the highest, plus or minus a half an hour. And so if you're going to be taking a treat at that time, that's a high GI treat, obviously it's going to shoot the blood glucose levels up even higher. So if you're going to have a high GI food, then the best way to do it is have it as part of the meal. Count it as part of the carbohydrate at the meal. Choose some lower GI foods at that meal to compensate. And so that way the protein at the meal, the fat at the meal, all of that will work together to lower that rise of blood glucose level after having eaten that high GI food. And then, of course, eating it every day, whether you have diabetes or not, is not necessarily considered part of a healthy diet, right? So I think all foods can fit, but it really is that the portion size and the frequency that you're going to be having it.
Great, thank you so much for that. And I'll just move on to one of our last few questions here. Where can I find more specific foods that are not necessarily located on some of the GI tools that I've seen?
So a lot of the GI tools will only have about 10 or 15 items on them, so you're right. It may be difficult for you to try and get a sense of whether this food is a low glycemic index food or not. So there are some lists that have been put on the resource list as part of this website and as part of this presentation. And so if you just go to the resource list, there are some URLs. So there's actually a Canadian one, which is www.gitesting.com, if I'm not mistaken, and that actually has some values of Canadian foods that have been tested. And of course, Australia has done a lot of work on glycemic index as well, and so you'll find a University of Australia website there as well that you can actually type in the food and in a search engine, and it will let you know if any glycemic index values are available for that food. And of course, there's also the Canadian Diabetes Association tool that I mentioned earlier. That's a great help, but for some of you, you might want just a little bit more information, so those other websites could be useful for you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Kathryn. And I'll just take our last question here, and it's around diet drinks, such as Diet Pepsi and Diet Coke. How do they fare on the glycemic index scale?
Well, that's an interesting question. So when we look at glycemic index, if we recall going back to the definition of glycemic index, it's really looking at the rise in blood glucose level, right, based on the amount of available carbohydrate. So diet soft drinks don't have available carbohydrates, so they would not be assigned a glycemic index value. A lot of people wonder whether they should be taking diet drinks or not. There's, again, a lot of research, or not a lot of research, but a lot of buzz around one or two research articles claiming that perhaps diet soft drinks are really not healthy for you. I mean, obviously, water is the best drink. People find water boring sometimes, so you can easily snazz it up by adding, a little bit of lime, a little bit of lemon, some mint, some cucumber, and things like that. It doesn't mean you're not allowed having diet soft drinks. The research that is tending to say that it may not be such a great idea, it's because the assumption is that if you take a diet soft drink that tastes sweet, even though it doesn't have any sugar in it, maybe it's allowing you to maintain that desire for sweetness, and if it's not there, that you're going to run out and get something that's sugary that will increase your blood glucose. We also can't be 100% certain that the research that's out there on the diet soft drinks is truly reflective of the diet soft drink or of the other health habits that happen. So you know that old adage of, well, I'm going to try and eat a bit healthier today. Instead of having a Big Mac, a large fry, and a regular Coke, I'm going to have a Big Mac, a large fry, and a Diet Coke. So is it really the Diet Coke that was the problem, or is it the fact that you're still having the high fat, the high sodium meal to go along with that diet soft drink? So again, thinking that all foods can fit, I really do believe it's a personal choice. Some people do not like taking artificial sweeteners, and you don't have to. But for some people, it helps them to manage making some of the other healthy lifestyle changes. It makes things more bearable. It makes things less stressful. So in moderation, I don't see a problem if someone were to choose to have that. Obviously, water being a much better choice, but sometimes people just get fed up of water and want to have a special treat.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Kathryn. And that does conclude our webinar for today. So for the questions that we did not get to, please feel free to email us at webinars@diabetes.ca, and we will be happy to follow up. I'd sincerely like to thank Kathryn for speaking on behalf of the Canadian Diabetes Association, and it's been a very great learning experience. I do want to remind everyone that our webinar today was recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. And once again, I would like to thank our supporter, Canola Eat Well, for supporting our Canadian Diabetes Association's webinar programs. And I want to thank everyone again today for your participation in today's webinar. This does mark our last live webinar for 2016, but we do hope that you continue to learn with the CDA by viewing our past webinars, and they can be found at diabetes.ca/past-webinars. There are a variety of topics to help you stay on track with your diabetes management, so please be sure to check them out. The Canadian Diabetes Association strongly believes that people with diabetes should live to their full health potential, so the Diabetes Charter was developed to ensure that people with diabetes are treated with respect and dignity, as well as have equitable access to high-quality care. We'd like to invite you to make a difference and sign the Charter, and that can be done very easily by visiting diabetes.ca/charter. And for those of you who enjoy our CDA webinars and would like to donate, we do encourage you to do so, as Boost Diabetic has pledged to match all donations up to $100,000. So for more information and to donate, please visit diabetes.ca/donate. And for those of you looking for some more support and resources to live well with diabetes, please feel free to call our toll-free line at 1-800-BANTING. So that's 1-800-226-8464. We hope that you've enjoyed learning with the CDA, and we look forward to your participation in the future.